Is the Brightin Star 50mm f0.95 the best affordable cinematic lens? This lens produces a soft vintage look with insane bokeh at 0.95. I've literally never used a lens that wide open, so you can get very unique looks from it. This lens is far from perfect, but it's easily one of the most unique lenses I've ever used. And at such an affordable price point, it is very tempting to get. So in this video, I'm going to go over all of the features of this lens, its image quality and low light performance, and whether or not it's worth picking up for yourself. Hi there, my name is Bruno Pozo. I'm a commercial filmmaker in Bend, Oregon, and I make weekly videos on filmmaking technique, gear reviews, and how to make money with your camera. If any of that interests you, hit that like and subscribe. Now, onto the review. Let's start by covering the main features of this lens. It is a 50mm prime lens, and it has an aperture range from 0.95 to f16. It is a fully manual lens, so there are no electronic parts in this like image stabilization, but that also does mean that you have to change things like the aperture manually and focus manually. The focus ring is super smooth, but it does have a terribly long throw. The minimum distance this lens can focus is about half a meter or 1.5 feet. The aperture ring has hard stops at every single stop of light. You're not getting things like half stop control or third stops, but technically, if you're careful enough, you can rotate the ring enough to get in between those stops. It's made of a very durable aluminum, so it's basically all metal. It feels really great and solid in the hands. I love the premium quality of the materials because it doesn't feel like a cheap plastic. For its front element, you have a 62mm thread size, and the lens hood actually protracts and is attached to the lens. So you can't actually take this off. You can either retract it or extend it. And what's really impressive, even with the f0.95 aperture, this lens is fairly compact. With the lens hood retracted, it has a total length of about 3.3 inches and weighs around 1.67 pounds. So you're not going to run into any problems as it relates to fatigue carrying this lens on your camera body all day long. It is really small. And finally, the engravings on the lens are really nice. They seem really clean, and I love the etched nature of them, and you're not going to be disappointed by the quality of this lens. All right, but let's talk about this lens's image quality. And let's start with the standout feature, its f0.95 aperture. When you shoot wide open at that aperture, you get insane bokeh and probably the most unique image I've ever seen. Of course, you are sacrificing your depth of field, so you have maybe like an inch or two of usable focus when you're shooting at f0.95. So nailing critical focus wide open is really hard, especially because this is a fully manual focusing lens, but it's totally doable. As you can see in these images, wide open, the lens does have some character to it, like chromatic aberration. I think they call those the onion rings around some of the bokeh lights, and the highlights actually look like they're blooming. All this sort of creates a vintage, almost film-like look, which I really like. And of course, because of its fast aperture, this is a great low light lens, whether that's for like astrophotography or you shoot nighttime or outside nighttime or daytime interiors. This thing's not gonna have any problem in the dark. You can have very little light, even something as simple as a phone screen lighting up your subject, and you can expose pretty well with this. So I've really loved using this lens wide open. But if we stop the aperture down to something like f4, you can see that the lens performance actually improves, not only in its sharpness, but you sort of remove some of those chromatic aberrations and even a little bit of vignetting. On that note of vignetting, you can see here as we go from each stop of light, the vignette is somewhat noticeable wide open, but it cleans up fairly quickly and honestly isn't a deal breaker at all. As for this lens's focus breathing, I tested it from going from minimum distance to max and back, and you can see you do get a decent amount of focus breathing. It's not quite like a cinema lens where you're gonna get very minimal focus breathing, but at the end of the day, that's not a huge deal breaker for me, but worth sharing. This lens creates really interesting flares as well. When I was shooting outdoors with the aperture wide open, you can see how they actually play in my shots here. You get a huge glare across your scene, and it may be distracting to you, or it could be an artistic decision. I personally didn't mind the look of it, and so I kept them in. But if you don't want them, it's very easy to just extend your lens hood and get rid of them. And when I did an interior light test with my iPhone, you can see here it's actually a lot more controlled, especially when you close down the aperture. The biggest drawback of this lens is, in my opinion, its manual design. I'm really spoiled. I've come to appreciate the autofocus and the image stabilization of modern lenses, especially on the Canon lineup. They're super accurate, are surprisingly quiet, and the image stabilization works really well for handheld footage. And so going to a lens that doesn't have any of those features is kind of a step backwards for me. And although it's not the end of the world, it is something that it may impact your performance if you're shooting like run and gun or a wedding. Then having to obviously manually control the lens the whole time can be a bit daunting. However, the way they designed this lens, they do have grooves on both the focus ring and the aperture ring, so you can attach those little motors to control them using another device. The other drawback, once again, is if you're shooting wide open, your depth of field is super small. And so if you need critical focus, like for an interview or a product shot, then you may want to stop this thing down, which thankfully you can control that here. But it also kind of defeats the cinematic look that you get when it's wide open. And of course, there's no image stabilization and other technology in here, but that also does contribute to why it's so small and compact. And so it's really your give and take when it comes to this sort of thing. But if you do have a camera with internal image stabilization, it pairs pretty well with this thing. I know in the Canon lineup, you have to set the focal length of the lens you're using. And so when I set it to 50, it actually works really well with the IBIS and can overcome sort of that limitation that the lens has. But if you're shooting on something like the C50, which I have, that doesn't have IBIS, then you definitely want to put this on some sort of stabilization, whether that's a tripod, gimbal, or otherwise. But all in all, I really enjoyed this lens. 50mm is one of my favorite focal lengths because it is actually the first lens I ever had, which used to be that nifty 50 from Canon. It creates such a natural, almost true to life look with its compression and field of view. And honestly, I find myself framing almost for 50mm naturally just because of how much I used it at the beginning of my career. And so going back to it, but with a unique twist with the f/0.95 aperture, was a huge blast. And because it doesn't really distort your image too much, it's great for whether you're doing portraits, product, or landscapes. This is a fun and unique lens that's going to help you capture images with a ton of character. But what do you think? Would you pick this lens up for yourself? If you're thinking about getting the Brightin Star 50mm f/0.95 Mark II, by the way, you can get it for $440 for the Canon RF mount, Sony E mount, Nikon Z mount, and L mount. Links will be in the description and pinned comment. A huge shout out to Brightin Star for sending me this lens to review. If you enjoyed this lens review video, you can check out my Canon RF 24-105 f2.8 lens review here. Thank you so much for watching all the way until the end. I appreciate every single one of you who do, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.